This is Intelligence Matters, sponsored by Ginkgo Biosecurity, whose cutting-edge biological intelligence platform empowers national security decision-makers to identify and respond to emerging biological threats.
Chris Johnson is currently the president and CEO of China Strategies Group. He was a senior political analyst on China at the Central Intelligence Agency for many years, and he has been on our show many times. He joins us today to talk about the just concluded plenum, a major meeting of the Chinese Communist Party. We'll be right back with that discussion after a break. I'm Michael Morrell, and this is Intelligence Matters.
Biosecurity matters. What's biosecurity? It's the mission-critical industry safeguarding against 21st century biological threats. Biology doesn't respect borders. Ginkgo Biosecurity monitors critical assets and produces actionable biointelligence for national security decision-makers confronting biological threats, whether they are natural, accidental, or malicious. Ginkgo's technology tracks deadly pathogens worldwide, and our globally scaled platform, the first of its kind, detects outbreaks in near real time, deploys AI-powered threat assessments, and identifies the source of a threat, mitigating outbreaks before they become national emergencies. When lives and livelihoods are on the line, every second counts. Ginkgo Biosecurity, the biosecurity partner for an uncertain new era. Learn more at biosecuritymatters.com.
Chris, welcome to Intelligence Matters. It's always great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be back.
So, Chris, we're going to talk about the Communist Party plenum that just concluded. But I do want to ask you a couple of questions about this unprecedented moment that we find ourselves in American politics before we get to the plenum.
Sure.
And I'm just wondering, does anybody you know have any sense of what Beijing thinks about everything that's happening here?
Well, they definitely think it's not going to be boring. That's for sure.
I think we all think that.
Yeah,
they're great
they're
analysts.
With us on that
great analysts.
Yes, outstanding. No, I think what's fair to say is that prior to President Biden's very difficult debate performance in late June, the Chinese leadership, the Politburo, was like the rest of the world, really, which was, this is going to be extremely close. And therefore, we're going to kind of wait and see what happens, and then we'll adjust accordingly, right? And I think given that, their approach had been to sort of obviously think hard about scenario planning in terms of if there is a possible second Trump administration, what that might mean. I mean, obviously, we've seen some very tough potential trade measures already pre-briefed, if you will, by either President Trump or people around him, like the former trade rep in Trump's first administration, Bob Lighthizer, tariff rates as high as 60% and so on. So obviously they were sort of thinking about that, wargaming those and so on. And then the debate performance happened, and I think they realized, this is really going to be challenging. And I think immediately then you saw a shift in the senior leadership where that's my understanding toward, okay, let's stop screwing around. We have to seriously plan for a second Trump administration because this is how this is starting to look, And then again, they get surprised again with President Biden now dropping out, Vice President Harris very quickly locking up all the important endorsements and donations, and so on. I saw she just received, in fact, the endorsement from President Obama and Mrs. Obama, so that seemed to be the last major one. So I think they'll be focusing on that. And, my sense is a lot of the times the Chinese are a victim of their own propaganda, right? And so their propaganda tells them the United States is a deeply racist country, the United States is a deeply misogynistic country, and therefore someone like Vice President Harris, who is the first African-American and South Asian female to run for the presidency, and also a female, basically stands no chance in this place. So again, I think their instincts are heavily going towards thinking hard about a second Trump administration. And we see that in a number of ways, particularly in my interactions with a lot of Chinese contacts, a strong desire to do what they did in 2016, which is to try to get close to people who might be influencing Trump's views, especially on the trade topic.
Do you think they have a preferred candidate
I don't think they really do. To the degree they might have had one, once President Biden looked like he was going to drop out, it might have been the California governor, Newsom, in part because when he went to China, he talked very differently than most other U.S. politicians on China. And there's a view, I think, that perhaps he might be a little less forthright on export controls and tariffs and, the things the Chinese worry the most about. But I think the fundamental thing to understand is that, Xi Jinping made a conclusion some time ago and certainly reinforced in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and so on and so forth, which is that to some degree it doesn't really matter who's in the White House. The United States is out to block China's rise, to deny it. It's what it perceives as its rightful place as a leading world power. The technological and other things necessary to facilitate that rise and to ensure China's economy remains strong and so on. So the approach is set, basically from China's point of view, which is this is a deep and structural conflict which our system will ultimately win. And so, then it's all about the window dressing at that point.
Do you, and maybe there's not enough information to answer this question, but do you sense that should Harris win, that there would be much daylight between a Biden administration's approach and a Harris administration's approach, or just too tough to tell?
Yeah, I think it's too hard to say. To the degree we can get a glimpse, I think it's a situation where it looks like she's largely endorsed, the policies of the Biden administration. One area that I've heard from several people is that on the issue of export control, she does feel very strongly the administration's taken the right approach there. And I think she does feel very strongly that it is important to deny the Chinese the ability to dominate what they would call the commanding heights of, the AI and quantum and so on enabled future. I think what's interesting is that as a candidate, when she was actually running for president, in 2020 before she ended her campaign and then was ultimately selected as vice president, she made some pretty striking comments about trade wars, and sort of said that President Trump's trade war was a disaster and so on and so forth. Now, of course, that was 4 years ago and her views obviously would have changed. I saw that, I think it was Politico had tried to put together, sort of a here's what she might think about China piece, but it was just a weaving together of these quotes and so on. So my sense is she's kind of a blank page on the topic.
Yeah, my sense too. Okay, the recent plenum.
Yes.
Obvious first question: what is a plenum? What's the purpose? What are they trying to accomplish?
Well, plenums are these meetings that are held by the Central Committee of the party. Generally, once per year. The party constitution requires that they be held every once a year, not necessarily once a calendar year. And in a given 5-year cycle of a party congress, we typically will have 7 of these plenums. And there are a couple of them are dominated by personnel things that happen at the very beginning after a party congress. And then there are certain substantive policy ones. And this one that we just went through, the third plenum, that plenum historically has focused on the economy, but also more broadly on a range of other issues such as national defense and culture issues, a whole range of different things, the party system of governments and so on and so forth. And this is the kind of authoritative meeting that we have. In the case of these third plenums, their main focus is to sketch out a sort of medium to long-term vision for how the country will develop across a number of different sort of sectors.
How many folks on the Central Committee?
There are 205, I believe, full members of the current Central Committee, and then just under that, alternate members. So all in, about 400 people would attend this meeting. And, when you think about the fact that the Chinese Communist Party just announced that it has 99 million members, we're talking about, 0.0002% or something like that. So it's pretty rarefied air.
Yeah. And what happens? What do they actually do? What does a day look like?
Yeah, so they typically will hold these things over the course of 3 to 4 days. The current party secretary, in this case Xi Jinping, gives a speech, right, that sort of sketches out the Politburo's vision for whatever the subject of the plenum is. Then you have debate amongst the delegates around what's called a decision document. This is usually a pretty long, or resolution they call it sometimes, document that kind of lays out the policy priorities. And then that is, unsurprisingly passed at
real
the conclusion
debate,
of the plenum.
or
there's discussion. I think in the past there was probably more real debate than there is now. But even then, I think it's fair to say, these things were largely cooked by the time you got to the meeting. There weren't going to be substantial changes. And then when the meeting closes, we get a kind of short form communique that kind of gives us the broad strokes. And then, as I mentioned, these decision documents typically are released, and that's where the real meat and potatoes are, along with, interestingly, typically in Xi Jinping's tenure, what they call an explainer, where he kind of goes over the process and so on. And to your point about consultation, it was pretty clear from his explainer that there wasn't a lot of consultation. So for example, the Politburo announced the dates of the third plenum on April 30th. The explainer told us, I think it was May 7th, that, copies of this resolution were given to important party leaders, including retired party leaders. In other words, it was a fait accompli that they were handed at that time.
So have there been any particularly historic plenums that, stand out?
Sure. Obviously, the most famous one is the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee, which was held in 1978. That's when Deng Xiaoping launched what we now call reform and opening and put China on this path of market-oriented reform. So the lore, right, around that plenum has made these third plenums quite famous. And, to be fair to the Chinese, that then was followed up with a series of subsequent third plenums in each, Central Committee, certainly through the rest of the 80s and into the 90s, that also did pretty important things in terms of reducing the role of the state sector, emphasizing market-oriented principles, these sort of things. And then really, since the turn of the century, they continue to have these third plenums, but they've been underwhelming in comparison to that. And I think one of the main reasons for that is that in the case of that, the good old third plenum, the granddaddy third plenum in 1978, there was a fundamental recognition that the economy was headed, over the edge, that Maoism had ruined the country and that they needed to make a sharp course correction. We did not see that in this third plenum.
Yeah. And is any of this publicly visible?
You mean in terms of the debate, or
is there a C-SPAN, right? That is watching the discussion and the debate. Probably not, right?
No, never any footage from inside the meeting. What you usually get is a few stock photos of them kind of going in and out of the hall, and that's about it. And then when the plenum closes, they'll have this communique, and you have the Chinese Central TV broadcaster guys reading off a page and long screens of text. On the TV, so low production values in that regard.
So the economy was the big issue. Chris, give us a sense of where the economy is now, what was discussed, what was debated, and was there anything decided? Seems to me, simply based on what I've read in the Western press, that a lot of talk, maybe not a lot of there. Is that right? What's your sense of all of that?
Yeah. Well, I think, as we were just discussing, the first point there maybe is to sort of understand, what these third plenums do and don't do. And as I mentioned, they're meant to sort of sketch out this broad programmatic vision for the development of the country in that sort of medium to long term. So therefore, specific policy implementation is then generally left to relevant party organs and state ministries in their regular meetings, that will follow a plenum like this. So to give a very pertinent example of that, in this current context, most economists, I think you can say, both onshore and off, have agreed that the meltdown in China's property sector is the main factor driving the lack of confidence among consumers in particular. And yet, the plenum's document that we were just discussing only contained one half of one paragraph discussing the housing sector. And, that document was 20,000 Chinese characters, or about 18,000 English words. So, and several contacts I spoke to who were involved in compiling the document, the draft, indicated, the third plenum wasn't really the right venue for addressing what they characterized, interestingly, as a short-term crisis, despite the fact it's been going on for 3 years. So, with that as context around what they do, I think then the place to look for what their intentions are regarding additional stimulus and other things that outsiders and investors are very much looking for is any meetings of the Politburo or the State Council, China's cabinet, following the plenum. And in fact, typically they have the main focus of a Politburo meeting meeting that is held at the end of July, and probably will have happened by the time this podcast airs, is to review H1 economic performance and decide, whether any tweaks are necessary in the second half. And I think what makes that a little more complicated this time was the decision to hold this third plenum so close in, to that traditional Politburo meeting that looks at H1 economic performance. Given that, I think it's very difficult for that Politburo meeting to announce that there are substantial problems in the economy, right? Yeah. And that major assistance is needed, because they don't want to rain on the parade of the plenum, and where the message was very much, everything's going great. So I think, that said, though, the communique that was released when the plenum ended, there was a reference to the meeting having reviewed the current economic situation and concluded the government was sticking to its GDP target of around 5% for this year. So with a very anemic GDP print in the second quarter of just, I think it was 4.7%, and that disappointing figure coming out just as the plenum convened, it's obvious, right, that the economy needs more stimulus and to be able to reach, that already pretty ambitious goal. And yet, as I mentioned, at a meeting of the State Council the day after the plenum concluded, right, so this is their chance, the Premier Li Qiang only announced that the government would double down on subsidies, that had already rolled out in May, encouraging businesses to upgrade their equipment and consumers to upgrade durable goods like cars and, home appliances and so on. So, given the complete absence of confidence in the economy, if that's all the government has, then, they're probably in a tough spot. And if that Politburo meeting doesn't, provide a lot more meat, if you will, for investors to get excited about, given the cadence of how these meetings happen, we might have to wait till the annual Central Economic Work Conference in December, right, to get another look. And that's a long time for anxious investors and consumers to wait.
Yeah. So does she have a realistic picture of what's going on in the Chinese economy? Because it doesn't seem to me like he does, but I'm sure he does, right? But then how do you explain his approach?
Yes. Well, I think, the place to start is, this is obviously a big debate, and as to whether she is getting good information, not just on this, but on a number of topics. You may recall recently, I think it was a month or so ago, the Financial Times had a piece where, Xi Jinping apparently told the president of the EU, van der Leyen, that he was not going to fall for the trap, right, that the U.S. had laid for him in terms of, goading him to invade Taiwan. I mean, so, that raises these questions. My very good sense, is that he does have good information. He gets the information he needs. The question is how he responds to it, right? And I think two things, in talking to my contacts over there, have emerged. The first is that he has very set views, and therefore, once he is set on a course, when he set his stall out, if you will, it takes one of two things: either some significant development, not necessarily a crisis, but just some new data point that can move him, in a certain direction, or that creates an opportunity for his advisors to be able to say, this has now occurred, how about we think about it in this different way, or that he just decides to change his mind. So, with that as the context, I think here the place to start on this topic is that the official readout of this plenum should definitely serve, I think, as a sort of firm and resounding retort, I guess I would call it, to foreign investors and other outside observers who were hoping that Xi Jinping would see the error of his ways, I guess, and come to his senses, some would say, on economic policy and pivot back toward market-oriented reforms. In my mind, he clearly is all in on this program of pursuing breakthroughs in what they call choke point technologies. So most notably, like semiconductors, I think, and a crash program of industrial upgrading. And, if the rapid pursuit of those goals requires a hit to GDP, and even a fairly substantial one like we've been seeing, then so be it, given that the U.S. in Xi's mind is out to prevent China's ability to pursue its ambitions, as we mentioned earlier. I think just quickly, the other thing that the plenum document clearly highlights is that Xi's view for how to achieve these plans are firmly rooted in an even stronger embrace of the state sector than market-oriented approaches. For example, the readout of a meeting called for state capital and SOEs to get stronger, do better, grow bigger, and so on. And he's been using some of that language since 2015. But in my mind, the interesting element in the readout document was this additional backing for statist solutions, in that it was calling for SOEs to play the leading role in the Politburo's push for technological breakthroughs. So for example, it talks about state capital being steered toward, the major industries and key fields that are vital to national security, serve as the lifeblood of the economy, and toward those forward-looking and strategic emerging industries. So, against that backdrop, the private sector is largely left with some scraps, right?
Yeah.
The document says the government will support, I think the language was capable private enterprises in leading national initiatives that make breakthroughs in these core technologies. But the read between the lines of it is only if those enterprises reflect what they call patient capital, which basically means those that are not really that motivated by profit. And what private sector entity is not motivated by profit? So
we're talking with Chris Johnson, and we'll be right back with more after a break.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
So his dislike of reform at the end of the day is because he fears the political impact of it?
I think that's part of it. I also think he has his own unique definition of what reform is. So in his mind, these bibs and bobs that they've been doing and the strengthening of the party's oversight, of all aspects of the economy and so on, in his mind, those are reforms. They're his kind of reforms, not market-oriented reforms. And, organizational changes and so on that they made to guard against risks, to shore up the economy, to move in this direction of sort of self-sufficiency and so on. In his view, those are reforms. And I think, to be fair, they do have the right to define what they mean by that term.
Sure. But the reality, right, is he sort of has three problems, right? One problem is this kind of short-term macroeconomic cycles that every economy goes through, and he happens to be not in a great place in one right now, right?
Yes.
And then the second is the massive overinvestment that's occurred in the Chinese economy for a very long time, and that's why the real estate sector is what it is. But quite frankly, it's a lot of industries that there's massive overcapacity, and his approach is going to make that second problem worse, right?
Much worse.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. And then his third problem is demographics. Yeah. And at the end of the day, there's only one way to overcome the demographic problem, which is to move people to higher productivity jobs,
exactly.
Right? And that's reform.
Yeah.
So he might get to define reform, but he's actually, from an economist point of view, he's going to make the problem worse.
Yeah, no, I think that's all very fair, and especially let's drill down on the overcapacity issue in particular for a moment. But I think also the demographics, because they're fundamental. On overcapacity, I think several points to make. The first is that it's been shocking. I think it's fair to say, I've been doing this a very long time, at just the willful disdain or unwillingness to give any sort of public indication that they're paying any attention to the complaints from the United States and the EU and others about the overcapacity issue. Secretary Yellen goes over there a couple months ago. She's there for sort of an unusually long trip for a cabinet member. She makes the plea directly to her counterpart, Hu Lifeng, and others in the Chinese government. And, literally, as the wheels are going up on her plane, they're basically saying overcapacity doesn't exist. And I think it's part of the issue is that there's a view, because they've come under fire about it, that if they give any indication that it's a problem, somehow they're agreeing, with that criticism. And I think they feel they can't be seen as doing that. The other piece of it, I think, is that there's as there always is, there's a contradiction, right, between Xi Jinping has sort of diverging goals. One is he wants to do things that do take on the overcapacity issue, not really from the perspective of helping out foreign countries, but from dealing with the deflationary pressure that overcapacity causes for prices and so on in China's own economy, the structural imbalances that causes. And yet, his agenda to build up self-sufficiency and so on. One of the things that's interesting in the plenum document is that there's this almost bizarre reference to kind of having redundant industries in the country's heartland, right? And this is sort of a throwback to the Maoist period, right, where he had what was called the Third Front, and was establishing redundant industries in the middle of China for fear of a nuclear attack from the Soviet Union or the United States. So obviously Xi Jinping has a different view of that, but that will cause problems. And there's also a contradiction between that approach and what they've been calling this desire to do a unified national market. And that's very important in the sense of helping them raise productivity and so on. If you're sending a signal to the provinces that I want to build up all these redundant industries, they have no incentive to play ball on moving in the direction of a unified national market. So that's really problematic. And then quickly on demographics, there definitely were some nods to that in the plenum document. Certainly a lot of discussion around, like elder care issues, things like that, and some encouragement, for people to have additional children. But it's just not happening, right? The birth rate continues to fall. And it's one of these areas where you get the impression to some degree that Xi Jinping and the rest of the leadership, they almost see AI and technological upgrading as some sort of panacea for the demographic problem. To your point about productivity, if they can make these breakthroughs, then this will be the answer, or a significant answer to their demographic problem. And obviously there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, so great transition. As you said earlier, a lot of discussion about cutting edge technologies at the plenum. You talked a little bit about, where they want to go on that and what they've been doing.
Yeah.
And I guess a fundamental question is, can they do it? Can they reach their tech goals, right? This is it's a huge issue at the end of the day, right? They're taking a non-market approach.
Yes, they are.
Right. What's your sense?
Obviously it's impossible to tell. I think what we can say with confidence is that they've been trying to do this for decades, and they have not been successful. So, some of these, I've been doing this long enough to remember something called the 863 plan, which was called that because it was passed in March of 1986, where, the idea was, okay, we got to get serious about this technology thing. It seems to be important. And then they had the 963 plan a decade later, which was basically the 863 plan, because nothing had really occurred. And so, we've seen this sort of record. And I think part of that was that at the time, certainly with the 863 plan, when Deng Xiaoping says to these guys, go out and do technology stuff, they're sort of like, we're party cadres. We don't know technology, and there was a willingness, I think, because of the collective nature of the leadership and so on, that when results weren't achieved, it was sort of, oh, okay, well, let's try again. Under Xi Jinping, it's sort of, we must do this. I mean, one thing that's really interesting about the plenum document is they have given themselves a ridiculously ambitious timeline for accomplishing these goals. It says that they want to see these goals largely achieved by the time the PRC's 80th anniversary in 2029. That's 5 years. So, and we see accountability in a way in the system that we haven't seen in the past. So there's that. I think the other thing just to emphasize is obviously the core technology they're focused on is semiconductors, right? Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, this is not frontier science, right? People know how to make chips. The technology's out there. It can be acquired. And my guess is in the past, when we've seen them declare something a national strategic priority, they find a way to work, buy, and frankly steal their way to the technology.
Yeah. So this brings us to the question of the impact of U.S. sanctions. It's broader than just the U.S., right? But U.S.-led sanctions on exports of sensitive technology as it relates to primarily chips, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, how effective is that? There's a bit of debate about this, right?
Yeah. I think it's fair to say that depending on how you look at it, it's been largely ineffective. I mean, I was struck by, I think it was The Economist had a very good piece on this maybe a month or so ago, or a few weeks ago, where they were chronicling in particular the campaign against Huawei, right? China's telecommunications giant, and effectively said this has been an abysmal failure in terms of if the core goal was to prevent them from being able to manufacture, critical chips or have access to them. Obviously, we had this episode last summer where Secretary Raimondo is visiting China and they announce a new phone, this Mate 60 Pro that has supposedly a pretty decent chip in it, and release memes after she leaves news that kind of shows her advertising this phone and so on. It was all rather embarrassing. And I think
they're very good at that, aren't they?
They can be. It's a blunt instrument, but it can be amusing. And although probably not for Secretary Raimondo, so I think there was a desire to demonstrate we will find a way. And I think when we look at things in particular, such as this is not all up to the U.S. There are critical allies and partners, particularly the Dutch, right, with ASML and the machines that make semiconductors, and the Japanese with chemicals and components and so on. They have to play ball, and they have not been. And I think they have sort of said to the administration, they've been pushing them very hard to do more. In the case of ASML, for example, don't service the machines even that China already has. And I think the response has sort of been, we've done a lot. This is not great for our economy. You need to back off. And then, of course, the unstated stuff is we don't know how this election's coming out. And we could have Donald Trump, and he could change everything. So we're not going to do much more. And, interestingly, in the case of Japan, my understanding is senior U.S. officials who were over there recently, the Japanese, in a very un-Japanese manner, were sort of pushing back quite hard. And one of the reasons, apparently, was Toyota, right? A pretty important voice in Japan, is worried about the Chinese engaging in export controls on gallium and on NEV battery technologies and so on and so forth. So this is exceptionally complicated. And I think the Chinese are trying to work the seams, and to some degree with some effect.
And we were talking about overcapacity earlier. There's implications here, right, for overcapacity globally in a lot of green technologies. You just mentioned a couple of them. Yeah,
no, for sure. And I think the other issue is right, unintended consequences. So, obviously coming back to the Huawei campaign, one thing to think about is if you're going to take those actions, let's say you're successful and you slow them down by some number of years, which perhaps we have. But the outcome of that is to encourage them to double and triple down on all these other cutting edge technologies, AI, quantum, etc. Is it really a victory? Maybe it is, but I hope you have a plan for that piece of it, to manage those bits. And as you say, in these green technologies, they are very clear that they're going to be flooding the zone, with these technologies. And if you're, say, Germany, right, and you have a huge car industry that is completely dependent on sales to China. And also you're telling your domestic public, we're going green, but I'm going to tariff this car to a point where you can't afford it. It's just a very challenging situation. And I think the Chinese are just saying to themselves, let's see how all these contradictions, in the West play out before we get too worried. And that may be a huge strategic mistake by them, by the way. So.
Yeah. Okay, let's switch to personnel, because there were some personnel issues at the plenum, and maybe start with the former foreign minister.
Yes, very interesting. So after we hadn't really heard anything about him for a year, basically, I think he disappeared around this time last year. We had this very intriguing one line in the plenum's communique that basically said, very importantly, Comrade Qin Gang decided to submit his resignation from the Central Committee, and we've accepted it, right? And so for just a few words, there's a lot of import in there. The first one clearly is that he's still referred to as Comrade Qin Gang, which means he's still a member of the party. And I think that telegraphs to us pretty directly that he is unlikely to follow the process that we've seen now so many times of, being charged with corruption or some other shortcoming and going through a legal process and basically being jailed for the rest of his life. So then we have to ask ourselves, why isn't that happening to him? Because, clearly there was an issue. And I think we'll never know. Is the most likely answer there. What I think we can say, though, is that the party clearly has made a decision, and in terms of its adjudication of his case, that his crimes, if you will, were personal, not political in the sense of either monetary or other forms of corruption, or, as some speculation had suggested, espionage. Whether or not he was involved in other activities that might have had some connection to some of those areas, it's hard to say. And then, of course, the other issue is this guy was one of Xi Jinping's favorites, right? Nobody would have expected him to become foreign minister. No one did. So is there an issue there for the discipline inspection folks who are looking at the case? we don't want to embarrass the boss. And so it looks to me like they are closing the book, and I'm very doubtful we will ever see any kind of public accounting of what happened there.
Yeah, but it does sound more personal, right?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
That's definitely my understanding, and so you can engage in all forms of wild speculation as to what that might have been, but there's little doubt that there was a problem there, and it's significantly embarrassing to the regime in its content and scope that they feel they can't even say anything publicly about it.
Right. Okay, the military.
Yes, they didn't do so well.
They didn't do so well, so they're hit pretty hard. 2 former defense ministers are going to be tried.
Yeah.
More trouble for the rocket forces,
Yes.
I understand. So how bad is this? And I guess the key question is, do you think this is impacting the military's ability to do its job?
Yeah. Well, it's clearly pretty bad. I mean, the fact that you have 2 now former defense ministers both being brought to book and charged with pretty significant stuff. Even within the charge sheets, if you will, on those 2 individuals, the most recent former defense minister Li Shangfu and his predecessor Wei Fenghe, we see some divergence in terms of what may have been the problem. I think in the sort of charge sheet that we saw on Li Shangfu, it looks a bit like garden variety corruption, that sort of thing, malfeasance clearly in the procurement space, and we'll come back to that in a minute. In the case of his predecessor, Wei Fenghe, I think we see a situation where it's more about using his powers to help people get promoted and so on, kind of a traditional problem, within the PLA. So that's important. And then I think the plenum document was fascinating in that regard too. The communique, again, just, a couple of lines. But what's clear is that they announced a case that they hadn't made any public mention of previously, which was that the chief of staff of the rocket forces, their nuclear deterrent, right, and something that would be extremely important in any invasion scenario for Taiwan, also was corrupt. And this is very unusual for them to announce a case like that publicly in the context of one of these plenum communiques, rather than kind of doing what they did with the 2 defense ministers and saying, here's the case, here's all the information, they're kicked out of the party, etc. And similarly, we saw that, with all these people falling, right, there were vacancies on the Central Committee because these people are being chucked from the party. And the Constitution requires that those people be replaced by alternate Central Committee members in the order of the number of votes they received at the party Congress. And what we saw them do was skip over that order because one of the people who was involved in the lineup was another of these rocket force officers. So there's a huge and massive problem there. And then the plenum document also says, very sort of in ridiculous understatement, we will pursue some changes to the procurement process because we, we have a problem. So in terms of the impact on capabilities, obviously it's not great, right? And if you're Xi Jinping, you have to be asking yourself, are these guys capable, of conducting the mission that I might be requiring of them? Obviously, we saw some press stories and so on suggesting that their equipment doesn't work and that there were water in the missiles and all this sort of thing. I don't buy any of that. I don't think that's accurate. Discussions with some of our former colleagues and other people have hinted to me that that's not the case. But I think what it does do, if you're Xi Jinping, is say, I've got a lot more work to do. And that if I'm going to meet this goal that I have set out, that by the 100th anniversary of the PLA in 2027, I want them to be at least notionally capable of doing the job, there's a lot of work to do. That said, a lot of commentary has also suggested that, this continuing problem of corruption suggests Xi Jinping's campaign on that has been a failure, or even that he's just not in control, right? And I think we have to take a look at it from his point of view, which is that when he arrived, the problem from his perspective with corruption in the military was you had 2 very senior officers basically building their own private armies inside the party's army. That is not good in an authoritarian system.
It's not good. I'd worry about that myself.
Yes. That is, regime threatening, right? Whereas whatever the specifics here, what we see in these most recent cases, it's what we might call garden variety corruption. In other words, graft malfeasance. Okay, it's not great, but it's not a threat to the regime's control.
But it still says he's not getting this under control.
Yes, it does.
And why? Why is it so tough?
Part of it is it's sort of perennial, within their system. I mean, as much progress as he's made on that issue I described earlier, the fundamental methodology, if you will, in that earlier period was that officers bribed their superiors in order to gain promotion, on the prospect that once they got promoted, they would use their access to resources to pay these people back, their patrons. And so that process continues. And what happens if you're a senior officer and you don't fulfill that obligation? In other words, it's going to take an entire generational change in the high command of the PLA to get all that problem out of the way before. And then the other thing is, they're not paid terribly well. There's a lot of money sloshing around inside the system. They've been growing the defense budget like crazy for decades. And so there's a lot of opportunity there. For sure.
But it does show the value, right, of publicizing.
Yes.
What they did and what happened to them, right?
Well, you're right. And, this is the thing that's always interesting, whether it's on the military side in China or the party side. I call them candidates for Darwin's waiting room. These people who kind of think it's not going to happen to me when, it's pretty clear there's a sustained campaign going on. But no, as you say, I mean, it's embarrassing for sure. I would not draw parallels between, what that means for combat effectiveness and say what we've seen in the Russia case, vis-a-vis Ukraine. We can talk a little bit more about that if you're interested. But it's a problem, and it's going to be a perennial problem for them.
Yeah. Well, Chris, let's leave it there. Fantastic conversation. Always great to have you on. Your insights are terrific. Thank you.
My pleasure.
That was Chris Johnson. I'm Michael Morrell. Please join us next week for another episode of Intelligence Matters.
Intelligence Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry and Sophia Rubin. Intelligence Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.